Hi, my name's Philip Wong. You can find me at www.tetracarbon.com, and today I want to tell you about how to improve your LMS, or basically how to use formative online checkpoint tests to drive better engagement with your students. Today I want to talk about two main things about what you will see and what you will be able to gain. What you will be able to see is the 5 things that I want to cover, which are the situation and problem that I was in, the theoretical framework for which I used to solve my problems, the actual tool that fixed it, the rules, how it works, and basically where can you go to find out more. From what you will actually gain, there are 2 things I want you to know. The first one is an appreciation of how sustainable assessment works. I also want you to have a better understanding of your Asian students. I actually want you to also be able to actually go ahead and take these ideas and implant them into your LMS. I won't actually show you how to do this on your LMS because every single Moodle shell is going to be different, and indeed if you use Blackboard it's altogether different again. However, you can do this in Moodle 2.1 and above. So, I'll start off with the problems. In fact, I won't even decide the problem. I'll talk about the circumstances that I was in. I was teaching accounting theory, so basically accounting, to a large number of Asian students and international students. Well, many of them are from East Asia anyway. And this is not a problem, but I think you need to understand your client whenever you're in business. And the important thing is that as Western educators, we don't understand Confucius heritage cultures enough. And this matters because the way that their society is structured will impact upon how they learn. And I want you to understand that I'm focusing on the culture and not the race, because it's not about your ethnicity, it's about who you identify with and how you think. Now, the problem was that I had very poor engagement for what was a very word-based theoretical subject for, otherwise sitting in accounting, which is a very numeric-based course. Students just wouldn't buy my textbook, and those that did would just basically not read it. I had a very poor sustained effort in the classroom and a tendency to surface learn and just cram everything at the end because it was an awful subject for the students. This was very frustrating. So the other problem that I find is that because they hated the subject so much that they used the system of collaborative rote. I mean, let's face it, we just call it cheating. It's called plagiarism, and it's called trying to learn things by rote. It's very frustrating. So, what do we do about this? Does this at all sound familiar to you? And I'm sure that you're voting, yes, absolutely. And an older colleague came to me and he says, look, Philip, if you want them to do it, there's a very simple answer. Just put it on the test. They respect the test, they understand the test, and they will do it. Particularly for your Confucius heritage students. And look, this makes a lot of sense, except for the fact that this is me, sitting there at the computer for very long hours. Well, it's actually not me, it's one of my colleagues, but, we've all been there with the piles of test papers, and so we need to be careful that our problems, which we're trying to fix, aren't creating other problems. Of course, marking overload is the first and most important one. Another one is the problem of washback. So we've seen with the NAPLAN testing programs that a lot of teachers are now just teaching the test, and education becomes completely unimportant within this world. That's very frustrating because we're defeating our whole purpose of what we do. We need to think about also, am I marginalizing anything, or is there anybody that I'm culturally pushing out by, adapting my course in this way? And I was starting to think, well, given the number of international students I've got here, what is the goal of my so-called Western education? What is it that they're really coming here for? And indeed, if I change anything, will it still be cognitively aligned under Biggs and Tang's concepts? And, what about flexibility? If I just throw in a whole bunch of tests halfway through, that means I've got to mark it, and then, what happens if somebody's late to the test, or if they get sick, or how can we make sure that students are adequately catered for? So, I was thinking, well, I need to have some sort of academic rigor behind this, so I've decided to put down 2 main concepts, which are sustainable assessment and inclusive design, particularly looking at my Confucius cohort. And that was going to form the foundation for which everything else I was going to build on, the tools on top of that. So I'm going to kick it off by looking at the sustainable assessment first. Sustainable assessment is this whole idea that we shouldn't burn the earth today, so we've got something left over tomorrow and for our kids' future. And Boyd, who I believe he's from UTS in Sydney, and he had this really neat concept of just taking this same idea and applying it to pedagogy. And the quotation goes, sustainable assessment is assessment that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of students to meet their own future learning needs. And this is really, really neat, because what he's trying to say here is that the student should be able to learn from the assessment in a way that helps them solve problems in the real world after they have passed the test, and not in the lead up to passing the test. And he goes, well, look, assessment has a double duty here, where its two main purposes are certification and also aiding learning. And we need to really get back to that aiding the learning thing, because that's what education is all about. So if we sort of break down education into this timeline, students come to us with with their own prior knowledge, experience, and attitudes. And in my experience, they come with very little knowledge, but geez, they come with a lot of attitude, maybe sometimes. And we give them a whole bunch of learning objectives of what we think they're going to learn. Then we try to go and teach them. Maybe we even give them a formative assessment halfway through, and we'll try and give them some feedback. I mean, God, it's only 24 hours in my day. Maybe you have time to do even more feedback, because it's just time consuming. And then we give them this final exam at the end. We grade it, and then we'll issue the marks off, and then hopefully, God willing, that they will actually change their behavior subsequent to that. So given this natural timeline here, we've got this idea of washback. Now, washback is saying where teachers start to teach the test, and so it's this real, how does that high stakes test at the end wash back into the teaching? And obviously, it's quite a negative sort of a term, because it means that any behavior subsequent to the test is completely irrelevant, completely no longer considered at all, and we just defeat education when we get this very bad assessment regime. Now, Biggs and Tang came up with the concept of constructive alignment, where he was saying that, Biggs was saying that the learning objectives, the teaching and learning activities, and the assessment tasks, they've all got to be in the same direction, so that we won't be trying to assess students in exams when actually we teach them to do practical stuff in the classroom. It's not aligned, it's not the same. If you're going to have somebody doing something practical in the workplace, then you would set a practical test, which means that you'd have to teach them practically in the classroom rather than lecturing at them, and your learning objectives must also reflect that ultimate intention. But that's really focused within the course. What was kind of neat about Boyd's sustainable assessment is that he was going, look, well, it doesn't matter when the assessment task occurs, but the real focus is on what do they do in the future. In other words, what is the real goal of education here? And I find this more than a cute solution. I think it's got some meaning to it. So Boyd said, well, look, in order to do this, we've got to have a focus on formative assessment and feedback. And we should be trying to design our assessment so that not only is it going to grade, but it's also going to give us the chance to teach using the assessment as a teaching tool. And he goes, well, that means that every student must be able to succeed if they meet that certain standard as well. So we shouldn't be matching to a bell curve where it's just essentially a race amongst students, but ultimately a meaningless race as opposed to what they can do at the end. We want students to learn to self-assess and reflect with their peers so that they get used to this whole, what is it that I'm doing wrong, so how do I get better thinking. And for feedback to be useful, it must actually be used. And I don't know about you, but like when we set these grading papers and we write lots of feedback and the students go, I don't care, what's the number, what did I get? Well, for one, it's heartbreaking, and Boyd goes, well, look, this whole idea of feedback might be sustainable to the student, but it's just not sustainable to us as teachers. So the sustainability thing is not just about the future, it's about equity as well, and that is equity for all parties in this process, including the teacher itself. So I thought that was kind of neat, and I wanted to build into something else called inclusive design. So I'm going to start there before I get into the culture. I'm going to present to you two pictures here. The first picture is of the Victorian Parliament, and what you can see here is something very grand, something from out of a century or two ago, and stairs and columns and all of these things. And here is another Parliament House in Canberra, and it's also got the columns, but they're a bit more squarer. And what should smash you in the face, it's that obvious, but it's not, is that the second picture doesn't have any stairs, but it's still just as grand. The columns are still there to indicate unity amongst the parliamentary members and all that fun stuff, but there's no stairs. That's important because if you're disabled and you have a wheelchair, your entrance for the Victorian Parliament is round the back, which is symbolically saying that you're excluded from society and you're not important. But if you go to the Federal Parliament, you can wheel your wheelchair straight through the front door. In fact, the benefits of good inclusive design are there for everybody because even though it was designed for disabled people, mothers pushing prams, cameramen carrying equipment, tradesmen with wheeling their equipment along also benefit from not having stairs there. And so even though you focus on one group, you can actually design a learning environment that's going to benefit everybody, but you've paid attention to one issue, and that's really good, subtle, inclusive design. So now I've thought about it from pedagogical perspective, I want to actually think about, well, what about culture? And I needed some sort of framework of culture before I started looking at my Asian students in particular. Halstead was a world leader in culture, and so he broke down culture into about 4 or 5 different cultural dimensions, and where it was one thing versus another thing. Let's have a look through those. The first one is strong power distance versus weak power distance. So this is talking about hierarchical societies versus those that are more equal. In Australia, we'd like to think that we're more equal, whereas in, I don't know, say India with its caste, or traditionally caste system, there is definitely a society place where everybody fits. Some countries are more collectivist, such as Japan. Some countries are more about me, the individual. That would be, I don't know, maybe America. Some countries are really masculine and some are more feminine. Now this is defined as being how cool or not cool is it to cross that boundary. So in Australia, if a man wants to stay home and look after his children, we don't necessarily look down on him for that. But there are some cultures where that's definitely not okay because everybody has their place. Now, there's also this issue about, do some countries want safety, or are they willing to just throw caution to the wind and have an entrepreneurial shot in the first place? Countries that are very, very safe are countries like, for example, Germany, where they want to know the outcome before they undertake any venture. And then the fifth version, which was dimension, which was added later on, was long-term versus short-term. Now, an investment in forestry is going to take basically a lifetime, but if you want to eat, cream candy buns, then you're going to want that, sugar's always about the here and now. So there are countries that are very long-term focused. China is one, and there are some other cultures that are more short-term focused, and there are a lot of African cultures that have been identified by Hofstede. Now, I was interested in my Asian students because they were the major stakeholder in my room. And as it turns out, it's everything on the right here. So Confucius heritage cultures are driven by a very hierarchical nature, where people have their place, they think in groups. Male and female has its definitely defined roles, and you're going to seek safety rather than trying to do crazy things, and you're going to be focused on the long term. So this has impacts for the classroom, such as things like gamification is a real short-term sugar hit where you're trying to reward people for their short-term behavior, but in the long term that might not matter necessarily. So things to note about this for Confucius heritage cultures is that this creates very strong role pairs between people in society, and so male and female have their place, parent and child have their place, and indeed teacher to a student have a very strong role pair in Confucius heritage cultures. I'll give you an example. It's a bit of a caricature because it's not real, but it illustrates my point perfectly. Wax on, wax off. This example of cross-cultural communication between the West and the East is a great caricature because it gets across my point exactly. Here we have an old man teaching a young, crazy kid. And the old man's a little bit eccentric, but geez, he knows his stuff. And this really illustrates what a good teacher is and our different understandings of what a good teacher is. In the East, a good teacher is your master. They understand you, and they are always right. And the Karate Kid is interesting because, you've got this young, hot-headed little boy who tries to, sneaky get around things, but somehow the master's always got one up on him because the master always knows his stuff. This is important because in the East, this is what we expect out of our teachers. But at the same time, too, you will notice that the master is also very caring and plays a shepherd role, which we do not do in the West. So if a student would come to me in the West and they'd say, "Oh, look, Philip, I'm having a mental breakdown, or there is something really bad happening in my life," I'm actually not allowed to give that person advice. I have to push that student off to student services, and counselors will deal with that. But in the East, the master is expected to try and guide you through life, not just through the course content. And in the East, it's totally cool to turn up to your master's birthday ceremony or birthday parties, and to make house calls to his home, for him to, give you his personal QQ account so you can friend him there. But, if you friend me on Facebook here in the West, I don't want to know you. I don't want to know what you're up to on the weekend. And I certainly don't want to be sharing my family baby photos with you, my students. There is that distance in the West. Yet, at the same time, you can call me Philip. You don't have to call me Mr. Wong, or you don't have to call me teacher. Whereas in the East, there is that level of formality, but in fact, actually, the student-the-teacher relationship is much closer and much stronger than we think it is. It's actually more formalized in the West. So, just walking through some of these differences that Hofstede identified, and that was that in the West, we expect students to learn how to learn, but in the East, we actually want the students to do. This is important because in the West we think that we learn by arguing about things, but in the East they go, "You know what, I don't want to hear the chattering voices of idiots. I only want to hear the voice of the master because he's got all the answers. He's the one that's worth listening to." In the West we don't worry so much what people think about us because we can try and we can fail, but in the East, you know what, face consciousness is so strong, it's so important. And that means that in the West, students will ask questions, but if you're worried about face consciousness in the East, well, geez, you won't want to speak up because you could screw up. What if your question was a dumb question and everyone laughed at you in the classroom? So, it's just safer not to ask those questions in the first place. Now, this matters because in the East, it's a much more teacher-centric education. And the face consciousness doesn't just apply to the students, it applies to the teacher equally, which means that if you ask a dumb question, you'll be made to look like a fool. But geez, what about the opposite? What if you ask a really good question? In fact, what if you ask a question that the teacher doesn't have a pre-prepared answer for and you make him look like an idiot? Wouldn't you be a bad student? So we have to be very careful here because when a student is quiet in the classroom or they're not chatting on the LMS in our forums, it might actually be because the student respects the teacher and not because they're not engaging. So in the West, we make noises about student-centered education, which Doherty and Singh have written about, and I'm not particularly convinced about it, but there's a definite difference in thinking. So students are allowed to criticize or contradict teachers in the classroom or indeed on the LMS, but in the East, well, that's just not going to happen. That's rude. And in the West, because we like these out there kind of interesting people, younger teachers are going to be generally more liked than older teachers, but I want you to notice that in the East, older teachers are more respected. And I want you to notice that respect is not the same as liking somebody, although they're pretty damn close. In the West, you've got teachers who say, "You know what, I don't know, let's talk about it." Whereas in the East, my God, isn't that insane? You have somebody that comes from China as an international student, they pay a lot of money for us here in the West to educate them, and we say we don't know. I mean, what the hell? They've paid good money to find out the answers, and we tell them that we don't know. They're disgusted by this, this sort of approach. And teachers are expected to know. They're the masters after all. In the West, because it's a whole equal, back and forwards argument, we want to use inclusive language. But in the East, the beauty is in how you argue, and so teachers will use much more academic language. And in the West, male students can do, whatever they feel like. In the East, male students got to stick to, male subjects, engineering and the like, and female students, they've got their place too. In the West, we want our arguments to be straight to the point. You tell me what you mean. Tell me what you really think I want to know. Whereas in the East, we want to hear this beauty of how people argue, and so the idea is this sort of circular and frustrating thing for me to read as a Western person. But the beauty is not in a whole bunch of very direct linear bullet points like train tracks. It's in this trying to get to the point without trying to smash you in the face with it. So it's a very different style of thinking that we have of our Asian students, and they bring this culture into our classroom, and we teach them with a Western way, and they're not getting it. And they're not getting it because we don't know our clients very well. So I was starting to read all this, and I was thinking, you know what? There's got to be a way to fix this, and so I've come up with this tool and its various rules to address these particular cohort. So here's the tool and here's the rules. I gave them a weekly quiz on the LMS. It's just multiple choice questions. The average was worth 10% of the final grade, and I made it really simple. So there was 11 topics I want them to know. I've got 11 chapters from the textbook. There are 11 checkpoints that they have to do at the end of every topic. And on the final exam, there are 11 questions. Question 1 will be answered by week 1, chapter 1 book, and you've already done the quiz of it, which was quiz number 1. Each quiz had about 10 to 14 multiple choice questions, so they're not big. But to make it serious, I only gave you one attempt, so you couldn't just constantly try, and I've limited it to 1 hour. So in other words, 10 questions over 1 hour is not particularly time pressured. But it's serious enough. Now the questions were randomized from a very large bank, so that if I did the quiz before you did, there was no first mover disadvantage. And even within the MCQs, they would be randomized as well. And then the questions were going to be grouped by learning objective to ensure that even though they're randomly selected, that I've ensured complete coverage over the courseware. I mean, none of this is particularly exciting at this stage. Students can do the test whenever they want, which means that it's a little bit more flexible for the students in case somebody gets sick or something goes wrong. And the students will automatically get the results, but they won't get the answers to each and every question. They'll just get 5 out of 10 or whatever. Now, if they feel particularly ripped off because they only get 3 out of 14 and they thought that they did a lot better, then they can come and book a time to see me, and we can sit down, we can talk about why and what they've done, and perhaps there's a problem with my question, in which case I will just grant the student the mark for free, basically. But they've got to prove to me that my question is either misleading or wrong or has a problem with it. So it means I'm getting my course proofread at the same time as I'm actually helping the student and encouraging them to come see me. So this is interesting because here's the kicker to the whole thing. This is what makes it worthwhile. Each checkpoint unlocks the next topic, and that must mean that students must do the quiz for week 1 to get to week 2's learning material. And everything else behind week 2 is going to be locked away, and that includes the handouts for the students, the MP3 recording of my lecture, the PowerPoint slides and videos, and indeed the tutorial solutions, and this is what the students are craving, the easy answer. And I've locked it away until they've done week 1's worth of work. I'm actively obstructing the students from trying to do any advanced learning without doing the basic stuff first, because if the assignment is on week 6, what are they going to do? Go to the textbook, open week 6 and start reading and see if they get it. Of course they won't, because they haven't done the foundation stuff first. And the questions are quite difficult and analytical, but they're very, very specific to the textbook, which means that really you've got to have a book. Students that by week 8 or so have not engaged at all get an early warning notice, and this gives me a very good tracking of who's keeping up in the course and who isn't. So when I see them in the classroom, I can hit them up. Now, going back to my framework of ideas, why is this particularly sustainable? Well, the first one is time. But I'm going to give you the bad news first, and that is it's not easy to set up, and it does actually take quite a bit of thinking and time, but once you've done it, hey, it's reusable forever, and that's just wonderful. And in fact, it's not so hard when you realize that the questions can come from the publisher question bank, because really they're the ones that wrote the textbook, and in fact their questions very much match the textbook very, very closely. And that's a good thing because I want them to read the book. Now, suppose that you do make a mistake. When the student comes and sees you, well, and they complain about your question, that's actually really, really good, even if you give them the mark for free, because it helps you proofread your own question bank. And, everybody makes mistakes, but it's sustainable on my time because I'm always getting better, and, the things that I'm improving are the points where I need it the most. The lockstep nature is sustainable for the students because it forces them to see the fundamentals before they go on and do the more advanced stuff. And this is going to prevent cramming. It has definitely reduced my fail rate, and it encourages reading before they're progressing, which is a nice way of saying that basically we're discouraging you from trying to jump around too much without the structure of the course, and enables me, the teacher, to actually guide the student when and where they need it, because I can just look at the LMS and know where you're up to. Now, what I also found is that students would agonize over their checkpoint result, despite the fact that it was only worth 10%. Each question might be worth 0.07% of the final mark, and yet, they would get upset about it with me, and that was wonderful. I loved it, because for the first time I had students that were coming and asking me questions, and they cared. They really cared, and they were upset about it. And what ended up happening was the students were engaging in deeper learning earlier on. If they're pissed off, it means they're engaging, because they weren't engaging before, they simply just didn't care. And the low scores were also used as early warning indicators because it meant that I could give the right area in the right response for the right student. And that's terribly difficult when they look at you with a poker face. Now, this was particularly important for my Confucius Heritage Culture students because particularly the Asian students really struggled with English, and so reading a theory book was hard going. So because it's essentially an open book quiz online, the students would get the book, do the quiz, and read it at the same time. And this effectively forced them to read the textbook very closely before they started the test, or even if they were stupid enough to actually start the test before reading the book, they would have to search for the details inside the book for a very, very short period of time. Now, I'm not so worried by this because this is actually an important professional skill where you don't always know the answer, but you have to look it up straight away and give a meaningful answer at the end of it. The second reason was that students without text were effectively penalized. Remember that I had very low purchase rate and extremely low reading rate. And what I was trying to show the students here is that, if you want to be a professional, you must be equipped with the right tools to get the right answers. It seemed like such a natural thing, but students weren't getting it. Now, I can hear the word cheating. Cheating! Well, yes, that's exactly what they do. Frequently they sit in the library in groups of 4, and it's wonderful. It's great because the person that was only going to have 10 questions before, if they sit in a group of 4, they now get 40 questions, which is 300% extra learning that they would not have otherwise engaged in. And you'll find that the strong person in the group will naturally want to teach the weak because somebody will ask why and an explanation will be given, which means that they have to verbalize that thinking. Now, we know that peer teaching is effective. There is research on this, and it's terribly hard for us to actually get them to do this because what we do is we try and pick you and you. You're now peers, and you're going to be good friends, and you're going to teach each other. And the student's answer is, get stuffed, no way. I paid you good money to do that. And so the students get frustrated at us. If they're forced into a room, they get frustrated at each other. It's a bad outcome. But what I've done is I haven't forced them to do anything. They just do it by themselves. And the students' natural tendency to cheat sort of tricks them into learning more. It's just, the emphasis is on natural here. I only have to set them group work where I'm forcing them into certain groups because they're sticking with the groups that they already trust. And high trust networks are what matters so much to collective cultures, that trying to get an Asian student who lacks English in together with a room with an Australian student and say, okay, well, I want you guys to teach each other via osmosis and do group work, well, it just never works, and everyone ends up angry, and teachers just don't get it why it doesn't work. So the thing that I like about this tool compared to a lot of our other techniques is that we're using Confucius Heritage culture learners. We're using their own preferences to try and get across our Western style of education, and we're not trying to bash them in the face with our Western superior ways of Socratic methods. This tool really avoids the assumption that West is best. Well, maybe not, actually. I mean, I can teach accounting to Asian students, and I don't have to teach them that their culture is inferior along the way. So, we also need to think about authentication because, well, I mean, it is an objective of our learning system. But I want you to understand that although there is, cheating in inverted commas, each student does maintain the incentive to actually remain engaged. Why would I trust you just to, do my test for me when there's no duty of care? You could stuff it up. So I'm going to actually watch you do it, and we're going to talk about it. Every student's butt is on the line. It's also valid because even though it's open book and even though it's multiple choice in nature, it does have a very low weighting. But I want you to understand that 10% is enough to make the students actually care, but it's actually not enough to be really decisive in a pass-fail situation here. And more importantly, because I've got the 11 questions, 11 topics, 11 chapters, 11 checkpoint tests, there's direct overlap for every single part, and so the exam, which is invigilated, validates my checkpoint tests anyway. And the key to this is that the tool is assessment, but it's not designed to assess competence in itself. It is designed to reward interaction, and that is both interaction with literature which they were not reading beforehand and with each other as peers to talk about and sort of come up with their own understandings of what I'm trying to teach them here. And this is sustainable assessment because it's not putting extra work onto me. It's not putting extra work onto the students other than what they should have been doing anyway. And more importantly, they're learning to overcome the problems using their own natural settings. Now, to the student, it still feels like a serious test, and so they treat it like it's this sort of summative assessment thing. And this is beautiful because it's subtle. To them, they don't see it necessarily. And this is the whole part about it being inclusive, and that is that although I've designed this specifically for my Asian students, when you get these checkpoint quizzes, you don't get smacked in the face with this idea that it's really Asian. In fact, it feels culturally independent. But what I've actually created here is something that's culturally appropriate because it'll work just as well for our Australian students, it'll work just as well for our Sri Lankan or Indian or any other student for that matter. We don't necessarily have to have the benefits purely occurring to one group alone. So, even though we're moving into this world of e-learning, I want you to understand that culture matters. It always has, and it always will. And let me give you a quick example of where cross-cultural communication really would be life and death sort of situation. When you're in Rome, well, Julius Caesar learnt to rule as the Romans would expect, but when he was trying to steal Cleopatra's heart, he would learn to walk like an Egyptian. Culture matters, absolutely. If you want to find out any more, you can visit www.tetracarbon.com. You can tweet me at tetracarbon. You can find me on Facebook. I've Facebook friends with all the students that want to be connected with me, along with everybody else that wants to be connected with me. And you can email me, philip@tetracarbon.com. I've got a few references to show where I got my information from. Thank you very much for listening.